While Noah dragged logs in the heat, cities existed, commerce functioning, advanced metallurgy, music playing at parties that lasted for days. The antediluvian world was not primitive, it was a civilization in full operation, and nobody paid attention to the old man building a giant boat in the middle of dry land. Most people imagine the period before the flood as an era of caves, primitive bonfires, and men covered in skins beating rocks to make tools. The Bible tells a completely different story. Genesis chapter 4 reveals a sophisticated society with clear division of labor, impressive technical specialization, and active cultural production. It was not the Stone Age. It was a civilization that mastered metals, created complex musical instruments, and built permanent cities with organized social structure. It all began with Cain. After murdering his brother Abel and receiving God's mark, he did not become just any wanderer roaming aimlessly through the desert. He did something no one would expect from a cursed man. He built a city. Genesis chapter 4 verse 17 is direct and specific. Cain built a city and named it after his son, Enoch. It was not a temporary village of tents. It was not a nomad encampment. It was a city, permanent structure, social organization, established hierarchy. The first urban zone in human history was born from the hands of a fugitive murderer. Think about what this means in practical terms. A city requires planning. It requires division of tasks. It requires a system for distributing water and food. It requires constructions that last beyond a generation. It requires laws, even if informal, to regulate coexistence. Cain did not merely survive exile. He founded a civilization, and his descendants did not sit idle waiting for time to pass. They expanded, developed, innovated. 5 generations. After Cain, his lineage had already produced specialists in completely distinct areas. They were no longer generic farmers doing a little of everything. They were professionals dedicated to specific fields of knowledge. Jabal, son of Lamech and great-grandson of Cain, became the father of all who dwell in tents and have livestock. This biblical description is not casual. Jabal was not an amateur shepherd caring for a few sheep in the backyard. He was the founder of an entire industry of large-scale animal husbandry, organized cattle raising, herds that needed systematic management, efficient transportation, structured commercialization, a complex economic system, functioning generations before Noah was even born. Visualize what this represented in practice. Thousands of animals being raised, fed, bred in a controlled manner. Specialized tents for different functions. Workers dedicated exclusively to cattle management. Established transport routes. Markets for selling meat, milk, leather, wool. A complete productive chain that sustained a significant part of the antediluvian economy. Jabal's brother, named Jubal, was even more impressive in his contribution. The Bible specifically calls him the father of all who play the harp and flute, musical instruments. Think about the technical complexity involved in this. A harp requires strings tensioned with mathematical precision, each producing a specific note when played. The body of the instrument needs to be constructed with treated wood, a shape calculated for adequate resonance, proportions that amplify the sound without distortion. A flute is even more challenging in certain aspects. Tubes perforated at millimetrically calculated intervals to produce notes in the correct sequence. The diameter of the tube affects the timbre. The size of the holes affects the tuning. The distance between them determines the musical scale. This requires knowledge of acoustics, refined woodwork or bone crafting, systematic experimentation over years or decades. Jubal did not invent random noise. He invented music, sophisticated art, culture that transcends basic survival needs. But the most impressive descendant of Cain's entire lineage was undoubtedly Tubal-Cain. Genesis chapter 4, verse 22, describes his specialty with words that should make any historian stop and pay attention. Tubal-Cain was a master of all works in bronze and iron. Reread that phrase slowly. Bronze and iron. Metallurgy of two completely different metals, each with its own monumental technical challenges. Bronze is a metallic alloy that combines copper with tin in precise proportions. Pure copper melts at 1085 degrees Celsius. Tin melts at 232 degrees. Combining them in the correct proportion, generally 90% copper to 10% tin, requires extremely careful temperature control. Primitive furnaces do not easily reach those temperatures. Tubal-Cain and his apprentices developed techniques to overcome that physical barrier. Iron is even more challenging. The melting point of pure iron is 1538 degrees Celsius. Reaching that temperature with ancient technology requires specialized furnaces, forced ventilation through leather bellows, high-quality fuel burning for hours without interruption. And after melting, iron needs to be worked quickly before cooling, hammered into useful shape, cooled in a controlled manner so it does not become brittle. Tubal-Cain mastered this entire process. Put this in historical perspective. The antediluvian world had industrial forges operating at full capacity. It had metal tools being produced in series. It had bronze and iron weapons being forged by specialized craftsmen. It had agricultural implements that multiplied crop productivity. It had all the technological infrastructure that we normally associate with civilizations much later in the conventional timeline. And all of this existed while Noah had not even received the order to build the ark yet. Now expand that vision to the complete scenario of the antediluvian world. Cities with permanent constructions of stone and brick, organized streets, public squares where merchants negotiated products from distant regions, herds of thousands of animals grazing in organized fields under the supervision of professional shepherds, musicians playing at public and private events, creating increasingly elaborate compositions, blacksmiths hammering bronze and iron in specialized workshops, producing everything from delicate tools to heavy weapons, an economy functioning at multiple levels, a structured society with defined social classes, a civilization in full creative and productive activity. And then Noah receives an order that made no sense whatsoever to any external observer. Build a vessel 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, and almost 14 meters tall. 3 complete floors, compartments for thousands of animals, in the middle of dry land, far from any ocean, sea, or significant lake, to prepare for a rain that had never happened before in that form. The Bible does not specify exactly how long the construction took, but Jewish tradition and many scholars calculate that the project lasted about 120 years. That number comes from Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, where God declares that man's time would be 120 years. Many interpret this as the warning period before judgment. 120 years, more than an entire century, 4 to 5 human generations by modern standards. During all that time, the world continued functioning normally at its accelerated pace of progress. And during all that time, Noah continued hammering wood day after day. Think about the daily contrast that existed in that region. On one side, the forges inheriting Tubal-Cain's tradition, spewing fire and smoke, producing increasingly sophisticated tools for a growing clientele. Molten metal flowing into carefully prepared molds. Young apprentices learning refined techniques passed from master to disciple over generations. Innovations being tested and implemented. On the other side of the valley or plain, a man with increasingly white hair and his 3 sons dragging enormous cypress logs, sawing boards manually with tools that probably included bronze from the same forges, fitting beams into a structure that grew so slowly it seemed it would never finish. The irony of this situation is brutal when you stop to think about it. The antediluvian world had advanced metallurgy capable of producing precision tools. Noah certainly used some of those tools to build the ark. Bronze axes to fell trees, metal saws to cut boards, chisels to make joints. The same techniques developed by Cain's descendants, the cursed lineage, were being used to build the only object that would survive the complete destruction of everything Cain had started. The civilization provided the tools to build its own ark of salvation, and then completely ignored the invitation to enter it. But impressive technology was not the only aspect of the antediluvian world that deserves attention. Genesis chapter 6 reveals the dark side of that advanced civilization, and the picture that emerges is disturbing in its totality. Verse 5 is one of the heaviest in all of sacred scripture in terms of moral condemnation. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man had multiplied on the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was continually evil. Analyze each word of that sentence. Every, not most, not a significant part, every imagination, and continually, not occasionally, not in moments of weakness, continually, without interruption, without pause, without repentance. It was not occasional sin from generally good people who sometimes erred. It was total, systematic, permanent corruption rooted in the very way of thinking of that generation. Verse 11 completes the picture with more devastating details. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence, not isolated pockets of criminality in dangerous neighborhoods, not gangs operating on the margins of society, generalized violence as an accepted social norm, brutality as the standard method of resolving disputes, murder, theft, oppression, systematic cruelty, all functioning as a natural part of daily life. The same civilization that produced refined music and advanced metallurgy also produced atrocities on an industrial scale without anyone considering this particularly problematic. And there was something more in that world, something that scholars and theologians debate intensely to this day without reaching complete consensus. Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 mentions an extraordinary phenomenon. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives for themselves from all they chose. And from that union were born the Nephilim, described as giants, the mighty men of old, men of renown. The exact interpretation of those passages varies enormously among different traditions. Some understand the sons of God as fallen angels who abandoned their celestial position. Others interpret it as Seth's pious lineage mixing with Cain's corrupt lineage. Still others propose different explanations. But regardless of the specific theological interpretation, the practical result described in the text is unequivocal. Beings of extraordinary physical strength and stature walked the earth in those days. Famous warriors whose names were known everywhere. Legendary figures who probably terrorized entire populations with their capacity for violence. Men of renown, but not renown for goodness or wisdom. Renown for brute power and domination. Now assemble the complete scenario in your imagination. Prosperous and simultaneously violent cities. Advanced technology being used both to create and to destroy. Music playing in squares while atrocities happened in nearby alleys. Markets functioning normally while the weak were oppressed by the strong. Giants dominating through physical terror. Moral corruption so deep that it infected literally every imagination of every human heart. And in the midst of all this, a 600-year-old man building an impossible boat in his backyard, preaching about a judgment that nobody took seriously, because Noah did not build in silence. Second Epistle of Peter, chapter 2, verse 5, specifically calls Noah a preacher of righteousness. He raised his voice, he warned, he explained what he was doing and why. For 120 years, his message echoed for whoever wanted to hear. 120 years of sermons about repentance, 120 years of warnings about coming judgment, 120 years of invitations to enter the ark before it was too late, and 120 years of being systematically ignored, openly ridiculed, treated as a senile lunatic who had lost contact with reality. Put yourself in the perspective of a common inhabitant of that era, someone born decades after Noah began construction. You wake up in the morning, go to the city market, negotiate your products with known merchants, buy what you need for the week, return home by the same path as always, have dinner with your family at the end of the day. And at some point on that routine journey, you pass by that plot of land where the crazy old man continues working on that absurd wooden structure. Your grandparents already told stories about him when you were a child. Your parents grew up watching the same interminable work, advancing at a snail's pace. Now you are an adult, you have your own children, and you take the kids to laugh at the impossible project of the man who thinks it is going to rain hard. Enough to need a boat in the middle of the continent. 3 generations of your family have passed, and the boat still is not finished. And the old man still insists the water will cover the mountains. Jesus Christ described exactly this scenario of disturbing normality in Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 through 39. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. They knew nothing. That is the most terrifying part of the entire description. It was not ignorance caused by lack of available information. The information was there, visible, public, impossible to hide. A boat 137 meters long does not go unnoticed in any landscape. A man preaching consistently for 120 years does not remain in absolute silence. They had the verbal warning repeated thousands of times. They had the physical evidence being built before their very eyes year after year. And they consciously chose not to perceive. They chose to interpret everything as irrelevant madness. They chose to continue their lives as if nothing was happening. Meanwhile, while the world followed its accelerated course of simultaneous technological progress and moral decay, life for Noah and his small family followed a completely different rhythm. Weddings happened in the cities. Parties were organized with abundant music and food. Business deals were closed, generating fortunes. Children were born into families that planned their grandchildren's future. People died of natural causes after long lives, convinced that their descendants would continue exactly the same routine. Forever, normality was so absolute and so prolonged that the very idea of catastrophic interruption seemed not only improbable, but completely absurd. Think about the unique social logistics of the antediluvian world and how this affected people's perception. With average longevity approaching 900 years, generations overlapped in a way that we simply cannot imagine with our current life expectancy. Adam, the first man, lived 930 years. He died only 126 years before Noah was born. This means that people who had conversed directly with Adam, who had heard from his own mouth the story of creation, of Eden, of the fall, of the promise, were still alive and active when Noah was young. Methuselah, the oldest man who ever existed according to biblical records, lived 969 years. He was Noah's grandfather. And doing the math with the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, Methuselah died in the exact year the flood came. Some scholars speculate that he may have died a few days or weeks before the waters arrived, spared by God from witnessing the destruction. Lamech, Noah's father, lived 777 years and died only 5 years before the flood began. This means that knowledge and historical memory accumulated extraordinarily in that society. The story of creation, of the fall in Eden, of the curse, of the promise of redemption through the woman's seed. None of this was distant legend lost in the mists of mythological time. It was first-hand account, transmitted directly from eyewitnesses to their descendants in personal conversations over centuries. Adam could tell his great-grandchildren of the 10th generation exactly what the Garden of Eden was like, exactly what the serpent said, exactly how he was expelled. And yet, even with direct access to that living history, Noah's generation chose total corruption. The construction of the ark itself was a public spectacle that should have attracted the attention of any minimally observant person. 137 meters in length is approximately equivalent to a 45-story building laid horizontally on the ground. 23 meters in width means the boat was wider than many houses of that era were long. Almost 14 meters in height represents a 4 or 5-story modern building. 3 internal floors with hundreds of compartments designed to house thousands of animals of all sizes. A structure designed to withstand hydrodynamic pressures that no other vessel of that era even needed to consider. Noah did not have a professional team of shipbuilders hired. He did not have a union of specialized carpenters. He did not have engineers calculating structural tensions. He had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, worked alongside their aging father day after day, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. They cut cypress or gopher trees using bronze axes that needed constant sharpening. They dragged logs weighing several tons using ropes, wooden rollers, and pure muscular strength. They sawed boards manually in a process that took days for each piece. They fitted beams using carpentry techniques that demanded millimetric precision. They sealed every joint with pitch inside and out, layer after layer, guaranteeing total waterproofing. The manual labor was brutal beyond what we can comfortably imagine. Felling a tree large enough to provide structural beams took days of repetitive strikes with axes that quickly lost their edge. Transporting the fallen log to the construction site required systems of levers, ramps, and rollers that multiplied the available human strength, but still demanded extreme physical effort. Sawing the log into usable boards meant endless hours of repetitive motion with bronze saws that cut slowly. Each stage was exhausting, and there were thousands of stages ahead. While 4 men sweated building salvation for humanity under primitive conditions, millions of other people lived building their own condemnation without realizing it. Cities grew in population and architectural sophistication. Commerce expanded to increasingly distant routes. Metallurgy advanced with new alloys and smelting techniques. Music evolved with more complex instruments and more elaborate compositions. New agricultural techniques were developed, increasing productivity. New products were created for growing consumer markets. New entertainments were invented to fill leisure time. Material progress not only did not stop during the 120 years of construction, it probably accelerated. The antediluvian civilization almost certainly reached its absolute peak of technological and cultural development exactly in the final years before total destruction. Historians and archaeologists frequently observe this pattern in later civilizations. Rome was at the height of its power and sophistication shortly before beginning its long decline. Ancient Egypt produced its greatest architectural works in specific periods, followed by fragmentation. Cultures tend to flourish intensely before collapsing. Noah's world was probably no exception. Some scholars like to speculate about the unrealized potential of that lost civilization. Average longevity of 900 years means that a single dedicated inventor could accumulate practical and theoretical knowledge for almost an entire millennium. A metallurgist could refine his smelting and forging techniques over 800 years of continuous experimentation. A musician could develop compositions of mathematical complexity unimaginable by our standards. a farmer could observe climate and soil patterns for centuries before drawing conclusions. The cumulative potential for knowledge was extraordinary, far beyond anything possible with our 70 or 80-year lives. But the potential was completely wasted. All that intellectual capacity, all that productive longevity, all that accumulated creative energy was channeled into systematic violence, institutionalized moral corruption, and continuous wickedness without repentance. The longest-lived civilization in human history used its extra centuries to perfect evil instead of cultivating good. And Noah's Ark continued growing slowly on the horizon, ignored by everyone. Year after year, the structure took gradually visible form. First came the keel, the central backbone of 137 meters that needed to be perfectly straight to guarantee stability. Multiple enormous beams were joined in sequence, each splice reinforced with complex joints and hardwood pegs. Then came the ribs, curved beams rising from the sides like the skeleton of a giant whale lying on the beach. Each rib needed to be curved at the exact angle, a task that probably involved steam, heat, and months of careful work for each piece. Then came the external covering, boards fitted and sealed one by one in an endless process. Then the three internal floors with their partitions and compartments for animals of different sizes. Then the upper covering with its 1-cubit opening for ventilation and minimal light. The people of the region watched from afar, year after year, decade after decade. Some laughed openly, pointing at the old man and his sons working under the sun. Others shook their heads in silent disapproval at the waste of time and resources. Merchants perhaps sold materials to Noah at extra profit, happy to take money from the madman while they could. A very few, perhaps, felt an inexplicable unease when passing near the construction, a discomfort they could not name or explain. But nobody entered the ark during construction. Nobody asked to participate in the project. Nobody took the warning seriously enough to change their lives. The side door remained wide open throughout the entire construction process, that enormous opening, large enough for elephants and giraffes to pass. Through stayed open as a permanent invitation for more than a century. Anyone who wanted could have entered, helped with the construction, guaranteed their place when the waters came. All it took was belief. All it took was accepting that perhaps the strange man was right about something nobody else could see. All it took was humility to admit that the unanimous consensus of society could be wrong. But an open door means absolutely nothing to someone who does not want to cross the threshold. And then the day arrived that would change everything forever. Genesis chapter 7 describes the sequence of events with precise details. Noah was exactly 600 years old. The ark was finally complete after more than a century of work. And something extraordinary began to happen that should have convinced even the most obstinate skeptic. The animals began to arrive. They were not hunted in organized expeditions. They were not captured with traps and nets. They were not dragged reluctantly by ropes. They came on their own. 2 by 2, the species considered unclean by the categories God would formally establish centuries later in the law of Moses. 7 by 7, the clean species that would be used for sacrifices and food. Birds flying from all directions of the horizon, landing in orderly fashion near the entrance. Mammals of all sizes walking along invisible routes, converging toward the same point. Reptiles crawling in organized processions that defied their natural behavior, all heading toward the same wooden structure that the entire world considered a joke. If the construction of the ark was already a strange enough spectacle, the supernatural migration of animals should have been a sign absolutely impossible to ignore or rationalize. Thousands of creatures of different species, many of them natural predators of others, walking peacefully side by side toward a boat built on dry land. Lions passing calmly by gazelles without showing any interest in attacking. Wolves completely ignoring sheep walking meters away. snakes slithering among birds without striking, bears sharing the path with deer. The predatory instinct that governed the animal world simply switched off temporarily by a force that transcended nature. And the world watched all of this. And the world continued eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage as if nothing extraordinary was happening. 7 days. That was the interval between the complete entry of the animals and the beginning of the rains. 7 days in which the ark stood there, completely loaded with its living cargo, with the side door still wide open to the world. 7 days of last opportunity offered freely. 7 days in which literally anyone could have changed their mind, walked to the structure, crossed through the door, guaranteed survival for themselves and their family. 120 years compressed into one final week of grace. Nobody came. And then God closed the door. Genesis chapter 7, verse 16 is specific about this crucial detail. The Lord shut him in. It was not Noah who lifted, pushed, and locked it. It was God himself. The invitation that remained open for more than 12 decades was now terminated in a definitive and irreversible way. The same patient grace that kept the door wide open for 120 entire years now kept it permanently sealed. The time for decision had officially ended, and the world outside still had not perceived that something fundamental had changed. The markets in the region certainly opened that morning exactly as always. Merchants arranged their products at the usual stalls. Buyers left home with their mental lists of necessities. The forges were lit at the customary time, coal-fed, bellows pumping air, metal beginning to heat. Musicians probably rehearsed for scheduled performances. Parties planned for the coming days continued being organized with details of food, drink, and entertainment. Life followed its absolutely normal course for some hours after the door closed, perhaps for an entire day, perhaps for 2 or 3 complete days of unshakable normality, until the sky began to darken in a way different from anything that generation had ever seen before. It was not a common storm cloud passing along the horizon. It was not the gradual darkening of late afternoon. It was something completely new in the human experience of that civilization. Because before the flood, the Bible strongly suggests that the hydrological cycle functioned differently from what we know today. Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 specifically mentions that God had not yet made it rain on the earth, and that vegetation was watered by mist that rose from the ground and by underground springs. Whether this represents total absence of rain or just a very different pattern is debated, but certainly what was about to fall had no precedent. When the first drops began to fall from the darkened sky, some people in the cities and fields probably looked up with expressions of genuine curiosity. Water descending from above in visible quantity. A strange phenomenon. Interesting from the standpoint of novelty. Some perhaps extended their hands to feel the drops. Children perhaps ran excitedly at the new experience, but soon everyone returned to their scheduled activities. After all, a little water falling from the sky was not going to interrupt anyone's routine for very long, but the drops did not stop after a few minutes as expected, and they became thicker and more constant and more voluminous. And what seemed like passing curiosity began to turn into real discomfort. Soaked clothes, muddy paths, outdoor activities made impossible. And what seemed like temporary discomfort began to turn into growing concern. Water accumulating in low places, streams overflowing their banks, fields flooding rapidly, and what seemed like manageable concern began to turn into genuine fear. Houses with leaks, animals in panic, children crying, and what seemed like controllable fear began to turn into absolute and uncontrollable terror. Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 describes the complete mechanism of the cataclysm with terrifying precision. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. It was not simply heavy rain falling from laden clouds. It was water gushing violently from below to above and from above to below, simultaneously in volumes that defied any possibility of survival. Underground springs exploding through the ground with unimaginable pressure, transforming dry fields into deadly geysers. Sky pouring out entire oceans as if cosmic dams of infinite dimensions had been suddenly opened without warning. What did the panicked antediluvian civilization do in the first hours of the flood while they could still react? They ran desperately to higher ground, almost certainly. They frantically tried to protect their most valuable possessions from the rising water. They fought violently for space in elevated places that quickly became overcrowded. The same systematic violence that marked that society for generations certainly exploded in its most brutal and desperate form when the question ceased to be comfort and became basic survival. The strong pushing the weak down, families separated in the chaos, children lost in the panicked crowd, and some, with absolute certainty, ran to the ark. The scene is easy to imagine in its horrible details. People who spent decades laughing at Noah and his family, now splashing desperately in the rising water, running toward the only structure that seemed capable of floating. Arriving at the side door they had seen open for more than 100 years, pounding desperately on the sealed wood, screaming names, imploring, promising they believed now that they always believed deep down that they just needed one more chance, swearing they would change completely if they could enter, offering everything they possessed, everything they could get, anything in exchange for minimal space inside that wooden box. The door remained irrevocably closed, not because Noah did not want to open it, not because his heart did not ache at the screams outside, because God had personally sealed it. The same divine grace that kept that door wide open for 120 years of ignored invitation now kept it closed by justice finally executed. The time of mercy had ended. The time of judgment had arrived. 40 days and 40 nights. The rain gave no respite for a single moment during that entire period. The waters rose constantly, covering first the valleys, then the hills, then the low mountains, then the highest peaks. Genesis records that the waters rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains, approximately 7 meters above the highest point of dry land. There was absolutely nowhere to flee. There was no ground high enough anywhere on the planet. There was no structure built by human hands that could withstand that pressure. The forges that burned for generations were extinguished under tons of water and mud. The markets that functioned daily for centuries disappeared under turbulent waves. The musical instruments that produced melodies and harmonies floated briefly as debris before sinking forever. The cities that Cain began and his descendants proudly expanded through generations of work completely disappeared under layers of sediment. All the accumulated technology, all the developed culture, all the achieved sophistication, all the practiced violence, all the institutionalized corruption, absolutely everything sank and disappeared as if it had never existed, and the ark floated. The wooden box that 4 dedicated men spent more than an entire century building with their own calloused hands, using primitive tools, working under scorching sun and universal contempt, was now literally the only object manufactured by human beings that still existed and functioned on the entire planet. 137 meters of cut cypress, fitted boards and pitch applied layer upon layer, carrying 8 people and thousands of animals in absolute safety, silently navigating over the liquid tomb of an entire civilization that chose to ignore 120 years of warnings. On the day the door closed, the forges were still burning, the music was still playing, the markets were still selling. And then came the silence. Not the silence of someone stopping to hear something interesting. Not the silence of contemplation or rest, the absolute and definitive silence of those who simply no longer exist to make any kind of noise. Everything The antediluvian world built over generations, the impressive cities, the advanced metallurgy, the sophisticated music, the violent empires, the feared giants, was completely swallowed in 40 days of uninterrupted judgment. All that remained was what a single righteous man patiently built in 120 years of ridiculed obedience. A wooden box floating over the absolute end of everything that existed.